Sometimes the greatest battles for justice happen in the most ordinary settings. In a modest courtroom tucked away in a bustling city, a young black woman named Elena Jordan prepared to defend herself against trumped-up charges. The officers who arrested her lounged in the gallery, wearing sneers of confidence, certain their badges and privilege would protect them. Little do they know that Elena holds not just her innocence, but also the power of the Department of Justice in her hands. This is no routine hearing. This is a battle for dignity, a moment that will send shock waves through the justice system itself. Elena Jordan never thought her life would be turned upside down by a simple drive home. Born and raised in a small town near Atlanta, Georgia, she had come a long way from her modest beginnings. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place at the Department of Justice, specifically the Civil Rights Division housed within the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. But before any of those achievements, Elena was just a determined little girl whose parents taught her the meaning of justice, empathy, and doing what's right, even when it's hard. That fateful evening began like any other Thursday. Elena had been in her hometown for a brief visit, partly to celebrate her father's retirement from the bench, Judge Kenneth Jordan, who had served the local community for over 2 decades. The dinner had been heartfelt, stories shared over bowls of gumbo, old memories floating through the warm southern air. Around 9 p.m., Elena kissed her parents goodbye and slipped into her midnight blue sedan, planning to make the hour-long drive back to the city where she was scheduled for a crucial meeting the following morning. The roads were dark yet familiar, wrapped in tall pine trees that swayed under the moonlight. Elena took comfort in the quiet, using the solitude to reflect on her father's proud smile earlier that night. She remembered his final words to her before she left the house. No matter what you do, always stand up for what's right. Let the truth guide you. Her father's unwavering commitment to justice was a legacy she had tried to live up to throughout her life, from law school to her role at the DOJ. Suddenly, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Elena's heart raced. She was not speeding. She made a conscious effort to always stay within the limit. The squad car's headlights beamed sharply, urging her to pull over. Confused but cooperative, Elena guided her car to the shoulder of the road. She rolled down the window, watching in the mirror as 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their silhouettes illuminated by the bright headlights. "License and registration," barked the taller officer, whose name tag read Peterson. He was Caucasian with a buzz cut and icy blue eyes that seemed to size her up disdainfully. The second officer, Miller, stood behind Peterson, one hand resting almost casually on the butt of his holstered gun. Elena swallowed hard but stayed calm, retrieving her license, registration, and proof of insurance. She knew the drill. She had studied enough cases at the DOJ to know how quickly these situations could escalate, especially for a black driver. "You know why we stopped you?" Peterson asked, leaning in close. His tone was clipped, the question more of an accusation than an inquiry. "No, officer," Elena replied politely, keeping both hands visible on the wheel. "I wasn't aware I did anything wrong." Miller chimed in from behind. "We have reason to believe this vehicle has been involved in suspicious activity," he said. His eyes flicked over Elena's interior, a neat back seat with a single briefcase, nothing more. Elena's eyebrows shot up. This was completely baseless. Suspicious activity? This is my personal car. I just left my parents' house. The tension in the air grew thicker. Peterson's lip curled. "Step out of the vehicle." Elena hesitated. She was fully aware of her rights, but she also knew that refusing could escalate things. So she complied, stepping out carefully. Peterson looked her up and down, then turned her around. Without warning, he reached for her wrists and cuffed them with practiced efficiency. "Hey!" Elena exclaimed, alarmed. "You have no grounds to arrest me." He ignored her protest and began patting her down. Miller circled around to the passenger side, rummaging through Elena's glove compartment. She could hear papers being tossed around. Her neatly filed documents fluttered onto the seat and floor. The humiliating search lasted several minutes. Elena felt the sting of injustice burning in her cheeks, but she kept her composure. She asked for clarity. "Officer Peterson, please tell me what exactly you're looking for." "I have done nothing." "Shut your mouth," Peterson snapped. "Suspect is resisting," he announced loudly, though Elena had made no move to resist. Miller snickered, shining his flashlight directly into her eyes as though to blind her from objecting. The bitterness of fear and frustration welled up inside her. She'd read about stories like this time and time again. Now she was living one. "We're taking you in," Peterson declared, tightening the cuffs until they bit into her wrists. He and Miller exchanged a smirk. "You can explain yourself at the station." Elena's mind whirled. She could speak up and say she worked for the Department of Justice. She could brandish her ID and put an end to this. But a flash of caution stopped her. These men were on a power trip. If she told them she was a federal employee investigating civil rights violations, how might they react? They might destroy evidence or, worse, cause her physical harm. She decided, for the moment, to play it cool. "All right," she said tersely. "Take me in." As she was shoved into the back seat of the patrol car, Elena closed her eyes. Her father's parting words echoed in her mind. "Stand up for what's right. Let the truth guide you." She had to remind herself that the battle for justice was rarely swift. She would gather her evidence, follow due process, and expose these cops for what they were. Little did Officer Peterson and Officer Miller know, they had just arrested the worst possible person to railroad. Someone who had dedicated her entire life to upholding civil rights. Someone who knew the system inside and out, and someone who would not back down. That night, Elena experienced a humiliating booking process at the county station. Miller and Peterson led her inside as though she were a dangerous criminal. They exchanged mocking glances with other officers. Elena caught snippets of conversation. "Got ourselves another troublemaker," one female officer sneered as Elena passed by. "A drug runner, I bet," a male officer commented from behind a desk. Elena wanted to refute their vile assumptions, but she knew it would do no good, at least not that night. Once her fingerprints were taken and she was forced to pose for a mug shot, an experience that made her stomach churn, Elena was placed in a holding cell. The cold bench and flickering fluorescent lights gave the room a harsh, unforgiving air. She shivered slightly, not from the temperature, but from the harsh reality of the situation. She was an innocent woman who had been systematically stripped of her dignity. Her phone was confiscated, so she couldn't call her family or her colleagues. She had one hope, that when she was finally allowed a phone call, she could reach her father. Judge Kenneth Jordan might have retired, but he still held respect in this community. He would surely move heaven and earth to help his daughter. Elena wished she could contact her immediate superior at the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, but that too would have to wait. Hours dragged by in that cramped cell. She replayed the arrest over and over in her head, analyzing every detail. She realized how these cops had orchestrated a routine to intimidate her, to possibly fabricate charges. The sense of indignation grew, fueled by her knowledge of civil rights law and the countless cases she'd read where innocent people had been railroaded. She had studied them like cautionary tales, but she never imagined she'd be part of one. When dawn broke, she was finally let out for questioning. Peterson and Miller sat on one side of a metal table, Elena on the other. Their confidence was unshakable, their arrogance almost theatrical. "Now, Ms. Jordan," Peterson began, folding his arms across his chest. "Why don't you come clean about why you were driving in that area so late at night?" Elena had to bite her tongue to keep her composure. "I told you I was on my way home from a family gathering. I live less than an hour away." Miller leaned forward. "We got an anonymous tip about that vehicle being used for narcotics transport." Elena's jaw tightened. It was a blatant lie, and they knew it. These men were either incompetent or corrupt, most likely both. "That's impossible. This is my personal vehicle registered under my name, Elena Jordan. There's nothing illegal in that car." Peterson brushed off her statements. "We'll see what the court has to say." A brief silence filled the room, thick with tension. Elena saw Miller suppress a grin, as though the outcome was already decided in their favor. It dawned on her that these officers had done this before, targeting unsuspecting people of color, filing bogus charges, making them fight impossible legal battles just to prove their innocence. Peterson finally rose. "You can have your phone call now. Make it quick." Elena was escorted down a hallway to a small phone booth. She dialed her father's number, heart pounding. He picked up immediately, his voice thick with alarm once he realized it was her calling from jail. "Dad," Elena began, her voice trembling. "I've been arrested. Racial profiling. I need help." The line crackled, and she heard her father's steady, reassuring tone. "I'm on my way. Don't say anything else until your lawyer arrives." "Understand." "Yes, sir," she replied, relief coursing through her. Her father, while retired, still commanded respect in legal circles. She hoped that would be enough to keep these officers from railroading her completely. After the call, Elena was returned to the holding cell. She told herself over and over again, "Stay calm. You have the truth on your side." The local justice system might be stacked with biases, but Elena Jordan wasn't just any defendant. She was armed with knowledge, determination, and the moral backing of her father's good name. She only hoped it would be enough. After what felt like an eternity, Elena was released on bail, arranged by her father and her attorney, a local civil rights lawyer named Elaine Davies. Outside the station, the sun was high in the sky, beating down on the small crowd that had gathered. Word had spread quickly about Judge Jordan's daughter being arrested, and a handful of reporters from local news outlets hovered near the entrance. Elena shielded her eyes from the glare of cameras and stepped quickly to her father's car. Once they were inside and away from prying eyes, Elena felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. Her father reached over from the driver's seat, gently squeezing her arm. "Are you okay?" She swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, but I'm furious, Dad. They set me up. They humiliated me. They took my dignity for no reason." "I know," he sighed, gripping the steering wheel. "We'll fight this. I promise you that. But, Elena, you need to follow Elaine's advice. She's the best civil rights lawyer in this county." From the back seat, Elaine leaned forward. "First things first, Elena, we're going to gather evidence. Any dash cam footage, body cam footage, or security cameras in the area. We'll request the 911 call logs to see if there was actually an anonymous tip. This could all be fabricated." Elena's hands tightened into fists. "They clearly targeted me for no reason other than my race, and they're so cocky about it." Elaine nodded, her expression grim. "Racism thrives where people think they won't be challenged. Let's show them how wrong they are." As they drove away, Elena felt the seeds of a plan taking root in her mind. She was a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ. Her entire professional life was dedicated to investigating and prosecuting those who violate the civil rights of citizens. She had every right and every skill to expose Officers Peterson and Miller. The question was, should she invoke her DOJ status now, or wait until she had more proof? She glanced at Elaine. "There's something you should know," Elena began, her voice steady. "I'm not just a lawyer. I work for the Department of Justice in their Civil Rights Division." Elaine and her father both turned to look at Elena, shock written across their faces. Of course, her father knew she worked in D.C., but he hadn't realized she held such a pivotal role in civil rights enforcement. He had always been proud of her accomplishments, but Elena's exact position had often been overshadowed by her father's own judicial career. The news was a revelation even for him. Elaine's eyes sparked with new energy. "My God, Elena, that changes everything. If these men thought they'd picked the wrong person before, wait until they learn you're with the DOJ." But Elena lifted her palm in caution. "I want to use that as my trump card. Let's gather all possible evidence first. If we show our hand too early, they might hide or destroy evidence or coordinate a cover-up. I'm sure they have allies in the department." Her father nodded in agreement. "Smart move. We'll keep that card close to the vest. In the meantime, Elaine can do the local legwork, and I'll start making some calls to folks who owe me favors." Elena forced a small smile. It was comforting to know she had a team. "Thank you, both of you." That evening, after a long shower and a much-needed meal, Elena sat at her parents' kitchen table, a steaming mug of chamomile tea before her. She opened her laptop and began drafting a timeline of the events leading up to her arrest. She noted every detail she could remember. The exact time she left her parents' home, the route she took, the moment the lights appeared in her rearview mirror, how the officers behaved, the humiliating language they used. She wrote until her eyes ached. Then she meticulously listed the statutes and precedents that might apply. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, citizens are protected from discrimination by law enforcement. She recalled Supreme Court cases, Justice Department guidelines, and legal theories that might help her fight back. If these men were systematically targeting black drivers, Elena wanted to uncover a pattern. Somewhere around midnight, her mother entered the kitchen, a concerned look on her face. "You should get some rest, dear." Elena glanced up, exhausted but resolute. "I can't sleep, Mom. Not while these men might be doing this to other people." Her mother sighed, crossing the small room to place a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "I understand, but rest is important. You'll need your strength for the fight ahead." Reluctantly, Elena closed her laptop. She carried the anger and determination with her to bed, aware that this was just the beginning of a battle that would force her to question everything she believed about justice and law. She'd spent her life preparing for a moment like this. She just never expected to be the one wearing the defendant's clothes. The next morning, Elena and Elaine wasted no time. They drove to a local diner rumored to be near the site of Elena's traffic stop. The owner, Mr. Matthews, was known to have a security camera pointed toward the street. He recognized Elena's father's name immediately and granted them permission to review the footage. In a small back office, Elena and Elaine sat behind an old computer while Mr. Matthews clicked through the timestamps. At first, the black and white, grainy footage showed nothing but an empty street, a few stray cars passing by in the late-night hours. Then, around 9:40 p.m., they saw Elena's sedan roll through the frame. A minute later, the patrol car's lights appeared. There, Elena leaned forward, watching the screen intently. Mr. Matthews paused the video, then rewound it frame by frame. They saw the moment Elena's car was pulled over to the shoulder, though the footage was partially obscured by the diner's neon sign reflection. Elaine squinted. It looks like they were trailing you. The patrol car appears a good 50 feet behind you before the lights even started flashing. Mr. Matthews drummed his fingers on the desk. I've heard rumors about these cops. Folks say they like to target certain types of people, if you know what I mean. He cast Elena a sympathetic look. Elena's chest tightened, both from anger and vindication that she wasn't imagining the malicious intent. Can I get a copy of this footage? Mr. Matthews nodded. I'll transfer it for you. Anything to help. We don't like crooked cops in this town. With the footage in hand, Elena and Elaine headed back toward the courthouse to file a motion for discovery, demanding the body cam and dash cam footage from the officers in question. As they left, Elena couldn't help but note the weight of eyes on her. The local townspeople had begun to murmur. The daughter of Judge Jordan was not to be messed with, especially when it came to matters of injustice. At the courthouse, they encountered the assistant district attorney, a man named Arthur Knight. Knight was a middle-aged professional with salt and pepper hair and a carefully measured smile. Elena had seen his name on cases before. He was known to be tough, but generally fair. He seemed surprised to see Elena and Elaine strolling in together. Elena, he greeted, adjusting his glasses. I've heard there's quite a stir going on. I'm sorry to see you here under these circumstances. Elaine didn't mince words. We need all the evidence related to Elena's arrest, including body cam, dash cam, and the alleged 911 call logs. We're filing a formal discovery request. Knight held up his palms in a placating gesture. I understand procedure must be followed. We'll cooperate. But keep in mind, Elena, that the county sheriff's department has their protocols. It might take time to gather everything. Elena's jaw tightened. Time is fine, as long as nothing gets lost along the way. Knight gave an unconvincing nod. I'll do my best to expedite the request. And Elena, for what it's worth, I hope there's a misunderstanding. We all respect your father greatly. Elena couldn't help but notice how he emphasized her father rather than her, but she forced a smile. We'll see what the evidence shows. Leaving Knight's office, Elaine whispered, he's probably stalling. Keep an eye out for any foot dragging. Elena nodded in agreement. Over the next few days, Elena dedicated herself to a tireless investigation. She reached out to the local NAACP chapter, discovering that multiple complaints had been filed against officers Peterson and Miller for racial profiling. However, each complaint seemed to have vanished into a bureaucratic black hole. She interviewed a local teacher who said she was pulled over by Peterson for failing to signal, even though she claimed to have signaled well before turning. She spoke with a young man fresh out of college who described a harrowing ordeal in which Miller threatened to impound his car for non-existent violations. A pattern emerged. These officers were systematically harassing black drivers on flimsy pretenses. While Elena was outraged, she also felt an odd sense of relief. She was no longer alone. There were others who had suffered under the same injustice, each having their own story. Gathering these accounts became Elena's crusade, and her father's reputation opened doors. Witness after witness came forward. In a folder on her laptop, Elena cataloged every complaint, every witness statement, every recorded conversation. It was a mountain of evidence, but she knew that in court, only certain pieces would be admissible. She would need to rely on Elaine's expertise to see what would stand and what would be ruled out as hearsay or irrelevant. One evening, As Elena sat at the kitchen table with her mother cross-checking timelines, her father came in, setting the local newspaper down in front of her. The headline read, "Judge's daughter arrested. Alleged racial profiling case sparks investigation." Elena grimaced. "They're running with it already." Her father took a seat. "This is bigger than your case, Elena. If you play your cards right, you might expose a whole network of corruption. But be careful. Corrupt cops have many ways to protect themselves." Elena nodded gravely. She knew the risks. Intimidation, evidence tampering, or worse could occur. But she was on a mission, and she owed it not just to herself, but to every other victim who lacked the resources or platform to fight back. As the court date approached, Elena's anxiety mounted. She had never been on the defendant side of a criminal case. She was used to building cases against civil rights violators, not defending her own innocence. The irony was staggering, yet this experience only fueled her sense of purpose. If it could happen to her, a DOJ attorney, it could happen to anyone. Elaine arranged a final meeting to prepare Elena for the hearing. In a small conference room with a single table, Elena's father joined them. Documents were spread everywhere. Body cam footage had finally been located by the sheriff's department, and Elaine had insisted on receiving it in unedited form. That had taken nearly a week longer than it should have. They hit play on the body cam footage from Officer Peterson's perspective. Initially, it showed routine patrol, shots of an empty highway. Suddenly, Elena's car came into view, traveling within the speed limit. Peterson's voice was heard radioing in. "We got a black sedan here, tinted windows. Might be a match for that tip we received earlier." His tone had an anticipatory edge that made Elena's skin crawl. As Elena's car pulled over, Peterson approached. The footage caught her calm compliance, handing over her license, stepping out of the car without any sign of resistance. Yet Peterson's narration to the camera was entirely different. "Suspect seems agitated. She's making sudden movements." Elaine paused the footage, her anger visible. "He's lying to the camera, creating a narrative that you're resisting." They continued watching. The footage ended abruptly while Elena was being cuffed. Miller's footage was no better. If anything, it painted Elena as a belligerent suspect, though she was neither raising her voice nor moving aggressively. "They're building a false story from the get-go," Elena muttered, clenching her fists. "We can prove that their commentary doesn't match my behavior on camera." Her father tapped the table. "This is your smoking gun, Elena. Show a jury what's on camera versus what they claim is happening, and you have a strong defense." Elaine nodded, but her expression remained cautious. "Yes, but we need to be ready for cross-examination. The prosecution will argue that Elena was indeed resistant. They'll say the video is inconclusive, especially since the angle is limited. They'll rely on the officer's testimony, claiming Elena was aggressive just off frame." Elena smiled grimly. "Let them. I'm more than ready to testify." They spent hours rehearsing Elena's testimony, anticipating the prosecution's tactics. By the end of the session, Elena felt drained yet prepared. Still, a part of her worried. What if local biases ran too deep? What if the judge or jury had predispositions? Leaving the conference room, Elena noticed something was off. The corridor was eerily silent for midday. She turned a corner and found a note pinned to the wall with her name scrawled in threatening letters. "Drop the case, or else." Her heart thumped against her ribs. Elaine and her father hurried to her side, both looking grim. "You need protection," her father said, eyes narrowed. Elena tore the note from the wall, anger flashing in her eyes. "I'm not backing down. This just proves we're on the right track." They're scared. A mixture of dread and determination brewed within her. She'd come this far, and nothing would stop her from exposing the truth. The day of the hearing arrived, a balmy morning with humidity pressing down like an omen. Elena dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit, her hair neatly pinned back. As she stood in front of the mirror, she felt the magnitude of the moment. Her father offered her a reassuring nod. Her mother gave her a hug that lasted several seconds. Outside the courthouse, a group of local activists, including members of the NAACP, had gathered. Some held signs reading "Justice for Elena" and "Stop Racial Profiling." News vans were stationed along the curb, reporters setting up cameras and microphones. Elena and Elaine pushed through the crowd, Elena's heart thundering in her chest. Inside, the corridors hummed with tension. Elaine guided Elena into the courtroom. On the other side, Elena saw Officers Peterson and Miller seated at a table, flanked by their union-appointed lawyer, a stern-faced man named Marcus Bolton. Peterson and Miller exuded arrogance, exchanging smug glances as Elena approached. She realized they still believed they could crush her as they had crushed countless others before. Judge Alexandria Winslow presided, an older woman known for her meticulous adherence to the letter of the law. Elena had researched Winslow's track record. It was mostly fair, though Elena worried about subtle biases. In the gallery, Elena's father sat behind her, offering silent moral support. The proceedings began with the state presenting its evidence against Elena for obstructing a police officer and resisting arrest. Peterson took the stand, speaking calmly as though reading from a well-rehearsed script. Ms. Jordan refused to cooperate, he stated, and made aggressive gestures that led us to believe our safety was in danger. Bolton asked leading questions, painting Elena as an uncooperative suspect. Peterson portrayed Elena as belligerent, raising her voice and threatening the officers. Elena bit her lip in frustration, remembering how the body cam footage had shown nothing of the sort. Then came Miller's turn. He elaborated on Elena's lack of compliance, describing how she allegedly struggled while they tried to cuff her. The man was so brazen in his lies that Elena felt her stomach twist in disbelief, but she forced herself to remain stoic. Her chance to refute these claims was coming. Finally, Elaine called Elena to the stand. The hush in the courtroom was palpable. The gallery leaned forward, and the reporters scribbled notes. Elena took her oath, her gaze sweeping momentarily over Peterson and Miller. Their smirks were as wide as ever. Elaine's first question was direct. Elena, did you resist arrest in any way? No, I did not, Elena answered, voice steady. She went on to describe the events of the arrest in detail, her tone calm and methodical. She narrated how she had complied from the moment Peterson approached her window, how she had stepped out of the car without protest, how the officers had twisted her words and actions to fit a narrative of resistance. When Bolton cross-examined, his questions were pointed, insinuating Elena had a chip on her shoulder. But Elena refused to be rattled. She countered each accusation with clarity, pointing to specific timestamps in the body cam footage and highlighting the discrepancy between what the camera saw and what the officers claimed. The pivotal moment came when Elaine moved to introduce the diner security footage into evidence. The prosecution objected, but Judge Winslow allowed it on the grounds that it provided context. The footage showed Elena's car traveling the speed limit, then the patrol car closing the distance far earlier than claimed. The timeline matched Elena's testimony precisely. Murmurs spread in the gallery. Elena could see the first glimmer of uncertainty cloud Peterson and Miller's faces. Their lawyer tried to downplay the footage's significance, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Before the recess for lunch, Elaine asked Elena to clarify her professional background. Elena hesitated, remembering her plan not to reveal her DOJ status until it was absolutely necessary. But as she locked eyes with Elaine, she knew the time had come. This would change everything. Ms. Jordan, Elaine said, stepping closer. Could you please tell the court your occupation? Elena straightened her shoulders. I am an attorney for the Department of Justice, specifically in the Civil Rights Division, working out of the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. A jolt seemed to pass through the entire room. Judge Winslow's eyebrows rose. Reporters scrambled to take notes, and the gallery erupted into gasps. Peterson and Miller exchanged looks of alarm, their bravado faltering for the first time. Bolton's mouth tightened into a thin line. Elaine pressed on. Were you at any point able to inform officers Peterson and Miller of your status as a DOJ attorney during your arrest? No, Elena replied, her voice echoing in the hush. I was denied the opportunity. I tried to explain that they had no grounds to detain me, but they wouldn't listen. They had already decided I was a criminal. Elaine let Elena's words hang in the air. The impact was clear. Peterson and Miller had not just racially profiled a random black driver. They had assaulted the rights of a federal civil rights attorney. The irony was staggering, and the courtroom felt electrified. Judge Winslow called a recess, evidently needing time to process the new information. As Elena stepped down from the stand, she caught the expressions of Peterson and Miller. The smirks were gone, replaced by something akin to panic. For the first time, Elena felt a glimmer of satisfaction. Let them squirm. They had spent their careers bullying people under the color of law, and now they faced a formidable opponent with institutional backing. In the hallway outside, Reporters bombarded Elena with questions. Microphones and cameras were thrust in her face. Ms. Jordan, did you hide your DOJ affiliation on purpose? Asked one. Are you going to pursue federal charges against the officers? Asked another. Elena raised her hands to calm the frenzy. I can't comment on potential actions by the DOJ at this time. My focus is on clearing my name and seeking justice for the wrongful arrest. Elaine and Elena managed to duck into a side corridor. They found Elena's father there, a proud but worried look on his face. That was a bombshell, Elena. How are you feeling? Elena exhaled slowly, relieved in a way. But we're not done yet. They'll come after me with everything they have. Her father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then they'll have to face us and the truth. During the lunch recess, Elena received a message from an anonymous source claiming to be an officer in the same department as Peterson and Miller. The text read, "Check the station's complaint records from 2022. There's evidence they're burying." Elena's pulse quickened. Someone inside the department was feeding her information. She hurriedly shared the message with Elaine and her father. If that tip was accurate, it could reveal a pattern of misconduct. Later that afternoon, Elena left the courthouse briefly under Elaine's watchful eye. She had arranged a clandestine meeting with the anonymous informant at a nearby park. She spotted a plainclothes man pacing near a row of oak trees. Approaching cautiously, Elena kept her phone on record mode just in case. You Elena Jordan? The man asked in a hushed tone. She nodded. Thank you for coming forward. He glanced around nervously, as though expecting to be followed. I can't stay long. I'm risking my job, maybe even my life, but I can't keep quiet anymore. Peterson and Miller are known for stopping black drivers without cause. Complaints pile up, but they never see the light of day. The sheriff's in on it too. They say management will handle it, but it always disappears. Elena's jaw tightened. How can we prove it? The informant chewed his lip. I've got a thumb drive with scanned copies of the complaints. I took them off the server before they were deleted. It's risky, but I need you to have it. He reached into his jacket pocket, producing a small USB. Elena took it, her heart hammering. This was the break she needed, the smoking gun that could not only clear her name, but expose a systemic problem. Before she could ask any further questions, the man turned and hurried away. Elena felt a surge of gratitude for his courage. That evening, Elena, Elaine, and her father pored over the files on the thumb drive. Dozens of official complaints detailed accounts nearly identical to Elena's. Unjust stops, baseless searches, intimidation, and, in some cases, physical assault. The demographic data was damning. The vast majority of complainants were Black or Latino. They're a menace, Elaine whispered, anger glinting in her eyes. This goes way beyond your case, Elena. Elena's father leaned back in his chair. We have to use this wisely. If we present it in court tomorrow without the proper foundation, it might get thrown out as irrelevant. But we must turn this over to the feds. Your office, Elena. This is a civil rights violation of the highest order. Elena nodded. Yes, I have enough evidence here to recommend a federal investigation. But let's focus on our immediate case first. We'll push for the charges to be dropped, and then I'll make sure the DOJ is informed. They worked late into the night, preparing to introduce the newly obtained evidence if needed. Elena knew that once this came to light, Peterson and Miller could face federal charges. The sense of looming confrontation weighed heavily on her. These men would not go down without a fight. Sure enough, she received another threatening note slipped under her parents' front door that read, "Stop digging or you'll regret it." She refused to let fear deter her. If anything, it hardened her resolve. The next day's proceedings began with a tense air. Elena could feel every eye on her as she took her seat at the defense table. Peterson and Miller looked more anxious than before, their attorney Bolton flipping rapidly through documents. Judge Winslow called the court to order. The prosecution insisted on pushing forward with the charges, but Elaine stood. Your Honor, the defense has newly discovered evidence that casts significant doubt on the credibility of the arresting officers. We request leave to present it. Bolton jumped up, protesting. Objection. We haven't had time to review this so-called evidence. This is ambush litigation. Elaine remained calm. This evidence only came to our possession late last night, Your Honor. It directly pertains to a pattern of misconduct by officers Peterson and Miller that severely undermines their testimony against Ms. Jordan. Judge Winslow considered for a moment, her gaze shifting to Elena. Finally, she spoke. I will allow a brief recess for the prosecution to review the evidence. Court will resume in 1 hour. During the recess, Elena sat outside in the hallway with Elaine. They watched through a window as Bolton and the two officers huddled, scanning through the documents. Peterson's face flushed red, and Miller began pacing. It was clear they were panicking. The weight of years of concealed misconduct was unraveling. When the court reconvened, Bolton looked visibly rattled. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the prosecution wishes to withdraw the charges against Ms. Jordan. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Elena felt a rush of relief mixed with righteous triumph. Yet Bolton wasn't finished. We believe an internal investigation is warranted regarding any alleged misconduct by officers Peterson and Miller. For now, in the interest of judicial economy, the state will not proceed with the charges against Ms. Jordan. Judge Winslow addressed Elena. Ms. Jordan, the charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go, and your record will be expunged of any reference to this incident. A wave of applause erupted from the gallery, particularly from the activists and local supporters who had gathered. Peterson and Miller wore expressions of utter defeat. Elena refused to gloat openly. She merely kept her head high, grateful her name had been cleared. Before leaving the courtroom, Elena locked eyes with Peterson. His smirk was gone, replaced by a sour glare. She leaned in, her voice steady but laced with steel. Next time, you might want to check who you're framing. Even though Elena's charges were dropped, the story was far from over. The day after the hearing, Elena filed a formal complaint with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C., attaching all the documents from the thumb drive and the diner footage. She detailed the pattern of harassment, not just against her, but against dozens of other Black residents. Within a week, a federal task force arrived in town. News of the impending federal civil rights investigation spread like wildfire. Peterson and Miller found themselves suspended pending the outcome. But it didn't stop there. When Elena's father quietly contacted higher-ups in the state's attorney general's office, the wheels of justice began turning at the state level as well. Reporters hounded Peterson and Miller for statements. Their attempts to paint themselves as victims of a witch hunt fell flat in the face of mounting evidence. When the sheriff was questioned about the missing complaint records, he stuttered through a press conference claiming ignorance. It did him no favors. In a dramatic twist, more officers came forward, emboldened by Elena's victory. They leaked additional evidence of corruption, including emails where Peterson and Miller joked about bagging another one after pulling over a Black motorist. Public outrage soared. The county commissioners held an emergency meeting. The sheriff faced calls to resign, and the local government scrambled to salvage its reputation. One morning, Elena received a phone call from Elaine. "Turn on the news," she said, voice brimming with excitement. Elena flicked on the TV and found a live broadcast. Peterson and Miller were being led out of the station in handcuffs, charged under federal statutes for conspiracy to violate civil rights and falsification of records. The image was surreal. The same men who had arrogantly stripped Elena of her dignity now escorted away like common criminals. As Elena watched, a strange mix of emotions washed over her. Satisfaction that justice was being served, relief that they would be held accountable, and a lingering sadness that such corruption existed in the first place, scarring the lives of countless people. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her supervisor from the DOJ calling to commend her bravery. "We're proud of you," he said. "This case could set a precedent for how we deal with small-town corruption. You've done the Civil Rights Division proud." After the call ended, Elena closed her eyes, feeling tears of relief slip down her cheeks. She thought of all the nights she spent pacing her old room, all the fear, the humiliation, the doubt. Now those men would face a reckoning. This was the power of truth, backed by a system that, at its best, aimed to protect the vulnerable. The next morning, Elena found herself awake before sunrise. The air was cool and still as the first light of dawn seeped through her childhood bedroom curtains. Despite the relief of her courtroom victory, she hadn't slept well. Images of Peterson and Miller in handcuffs, the overwhelming roar of the crowd outside the courthouse, and the haunting memories of that night on the roadside all cycled through her thoughts. It felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. She rose quietly, taking care not to wake her parents, and made her way downstairs. In the kitchen, she noticed the familiarity of well-worn tile under her feet, the comforting hum of the old refrigerator. This place, her parents' home, was both a cradle of safety and a reminder of how close she had come to losing her freedom. She brewed a pot of coffee, letting its warmth and aroma calm her rattled nerves. Today she was supposed to meet Mr. Matthews at his diner, the same man whose security footage had helped expose those corrupt officers for who they really were. A short drive later, Elena pulled into the parking lot of Matthews' diner. Its retro neon sign flickered in the early morning light, casting a faint glow over the few cars already parked there. The diner was modest, checkered floors, faded red vinyl seats, and the nostalgic scent of bacon and fresh biscuits in the air. Inside, morning regulars sat at the counter, sipping coffee and flipping through newspapers. Conversations buzzed softly, punctuated by the clang of utensils on plates. Mr. Matthews spotted Elena the moment she walked in. He stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a flour-dusted apron. At a glance, one might mistake him for a gruff, no-nonsense man, but Elena had come to see him as a pillar of quiet integrity in this town. "You made it," he said, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "Come on, have a seat." Elena followed him to a booth near the back, a spot that afforded some privacy. She caught a few customers casting curious glances her way. In recent weeks, her face had been splashed across local news segments, becoming a symbol of the fight against police misconduct. She tried to smile politely, though inside she felt self-conscious. Mr. Matthews slid into the booth across from her, setting down 2 mugs of steaming coffee. "I just wanted to thank you again," he began, low but earnest. "Not just for yourself, but for the other folks in this town who've been living in fear. These parts can be slow to change, and corruption has a way of digging its roots deep." Elena found herself momentarily at a loss for words. She took a sip of coffee, savoring the rich, earthy warmth. "It's not just me," she finally said. "It's the NAACP, the local activists, the other victims who came forward, and it's you. If you hadn't let us look at your security footage, this might have been an entirely different story." Mr. Matthews gave a slight shrug, but his eyes shone with pride. "Still, I know it takes real courage to stand up against men with badges and guns. You risked a lot more than I ever did." Elena felt her throat tighten at his words. She remembered the creeping dread in her holding cell, how she worried her story might never be believed. The knowledge that people like Mr. Matthews and so many others had bravely stepped up gave her a renewed sense of hope. "We're all stronger together," she thought. They chatted for a few minutes more, discussing how the town had reacted to the news of Peterson and Miller's federal charges. According to Mr. Matthews, public opinion was divided. Some folks were outraged by the corruption and eagerly welcomed the investigation, while others claimed Elena's victory was an exaggeration of isolated incidents. But the bottom line, Mr. Matthews stressed, was that people were talking, really talking, about racial profiling for the first time in years. When Elena finally rose to leave, Mr. Matthews gripped her hand in a firm handshake. "Don't be a stranger," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If we want things to truly change, we need to stick together. Keep the conversation going." Elena nodded, returning the squeeze. "I promise I'll be back." Leaving the diner, Elena drove across town to the local NAACP branch. The tree-lined streets leading to the modest building felt like they were draped in a new kind of light, one tinged with cautious optimism. She parked and walked inside, where she was greeted by a small group of volunteers and staff preparing for a midday reception in her honor. The room smelled faintly of fresh pastries and hot tea. Folding chairs were arranged in rows leading up to a simple wooden podium draped with the NAACP banner. Banners on the walls proclaimed, "End racial profiling now and justice for all." Elena recognized a few faces in the crowd. Some had shared their own stories of harassment with her during the investigation. As soon as she entered, a ripple of applause echoed through the room. A few members came forward, congratulating her, thanking her. A volunteer wearing a name tag reading S. Evans pressed a small bouquet of flowers into her hands, beaming. It felt surreal. Elena had come to this building weeks ago, fearful and uncertain, trying to gather enough testimony to defend herself. Now she stood here as a figure of hope. That shift in perception both humbled and awed her. A brief ceremony followed. One of the branch leaders, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrison, took the podium. She spoke in a measured, resonant voice about the history of the civil rights struggle in their county and how Elena's case had reawakened a sense of agency in people. She highlighted the importance of community support and the courage it takes to speak truth to power. Each word sank into Elena's soul like a balm. She felt both recognized and accountable. Her fight had never been for herself alone. It was for every voice the system tried to silence. When Mrs. Harrison motioned Elena forward, she took the podium, scanning the faces in the small but spirited crowd. She recognized a teacher who had told her about the time Officer Peterson pulled her over. She saw a young man with a sling on his arm. He'd been roughed up by the same officers. She saw tears in the eyes of some who had quietly endured similar experiences. Clearing her throat, Elena began to speak. "Thank you," she said simply, feeling uncharacteristically shy. "Thank you for standing with me when I needed it most. I might have had my background in law and the resources of the Department of Justice, but without your testimonies, without your willingness to step forward, the truth might never have come to light." There was a solemn hush, punctuated by nodding heads and the occasional sniffle. She recounted the days spent investigating, the nights poring over case files, and the unwavering determination she felt, fueled by the knowledge that others were fighting alongside her. "This isn't the end," she concluded, her gaze sweeping the room. "We have a long road ahead. There are more stories to hear, more reforms to push for, and more hearts to change. But each of you has proven that standing together, we can accomplish what once felt impossible." Rousing applause filled the room, and one by one, people came up to hug her, shake her hand, or simply whisper, "Thank you." As the crowd began to disperse, a gentle tap on Elena's shoulder made her turn around. An older woman with a cane, Miss Eleanor, gazed up at her through tear-filled eyes. "My grandson was pulled over by those men last year," she said, voice trembling. "They made him lie face down on the asphalt, never giving him a reason. He was so terrified, he still jumps at every siren he hears." Her grip on Elena's hand tightened, but knowing that justice has finally caught up with those officers gives him hope, gives me hope. Elena felt her own eyes sting. She placed her other hand over Miss Eleanor's. "I'm so sorry he went through that. I promise you I'll keep fighting for his sake, and for everyone else's." The older woman nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "You've already kept that promise, more than you know." That night, Elena's father announced a celebratory dinner at home. The house bustled with warmth. The aromas of simmering gumbo, freshly baked cornbread, and sweet potato pie wafted through every room. Relatives and close family friends arrived with cheerful hugs and exclamations, voices overlapping in a joyful clamor. Elena helped her mother in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring pots. Occasionally, she'd steal a glance toward the dining room where her father was regaling guests with the story of her triumph in court. She could see the pride glowing in his face, and it struck her that, in a way, they had come full circle. The same family, the same kitchen, but a new sense of validation and unity. Over dinner, stories flowed like a mighty river, some about Elena's childhood antics, others about her father's years on the bench, and a few jokes at the expense of Elena's early days learning to drive. Laughter echoed against the walls, bright and cathartic. In between bites of savory gumbo and sips of iced tea, guests complimented Elena on her courage, some expressing how powerless they had felt in the face of unchecked policing. In a rare moment of pause, Elena glanced at her father. He caught her gaze and smiled, a silent exchange passing between them. It was gratitude, admiration, and a mutual understanding that the Jordan family, father, mother, and now the daughter who'd become an emblem of justice, had made their mark on this town's history. Stand up for what's right. Let the truth guide you, her father had always told her, and she had. After the plates were cleared, Elena excused herself for a moment, stepping onto the front porch. The night air was cool, and cicadas hummed a steady serenade in the darkness. She gazed out over the moonlit yard, reflecting on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. She had entered this fight as a frightened arrestee, unsure if truth would prevail. Now the truth had emerged stronger than ever, supported by a community that had found new reason to speak out against injustice. On her last day in town, Elena visited the courthouse steps one more time. She stood where she had once been led inside as a defendant. Now she gazed out at the city, feeling an odd blend of nostalgia and empowerment. The ghosts of that traumatic night lingered, but they no longer haunted her. With the closure of her own case, Elena could focus on the bigger picture, the ongoing federal investigation. She had drafted a comprehensive report to submit to the Civil Rights Division, detailing the systemic issues, the flurry of evidence, and the new leads uncovered by other officers. She was determined to see it through to the end so that no one else would have to endure the kind of injustice she had faced. In the distance, she saw Elaine walking toward her, carrying a manila folder. "Thought I'd catch you before you left," Elaine said, handing Elena the folder. "This is all the paperwork for your civil suit against Peterson, Miller, and the department. I'm officially filing it next week." Elena nodded, a resolute smile on her face. "Thank you. They'll know this isn't just about my vindication. It's about accountability." Elaine returned the smile. "Safe travels back to D.C., Elena. The fight is never over, but you've shown everyone that justice can prevail when we refuse to give up." They hugged, a testament to the bond forged by adversity. Elena then climbed into her sedan, the same car that had been a stage for her wrongful arrest. As she pulled away, she couldn't help but think of the journey ahead. She would return to her role at the DOJ with renewed vigor, determined to root out injustice wherever it festered. The world outside her car window was the same, yet it felt somehow different. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she had stood her ground, or maybe it was simply the afterglow of seeing true justice at work. Either way, Elena Jordan drove on, the memory of smirking cops behind her and the road to a more just future stretching out before her. In the end, what began as a night of terror for Elena Jordan became a catalyst for systemic change, an undeniable proof that standing up for our rights can topple even the most entrenched corruption. Those smirking officers learned the hard way that a badge doesn't grant immunity to justice. It only heightens the responsibility to uphold it. Elena's courage lit a spark in her hometown and echoed throughout the nation, reminding us that the fight for civil rights is ongoing and that each of us has a role to play.